right. Testing 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. My name is Joel Jamal. Is anyone here familiar with my work? Good. For those of you that aren't, I don't want to be presumptuous. My name is Joel Jamal. I'm the head of Turning Point Australia. I decided to come up here to do a talk, but unfortunately, guilt by association. The media doesn't want us to hear from certain individuals here. They don't want us to hear from Jamie. Now, as an Aussie, I've got a problem with that. I've got a big problem with that. I don't like cancellation. I don't like censorship. So I am partly filling in. Jason's been doing a great job last minute. Jason's been filling in as MC for this event. You might see me chair a few conversations, like I'm about to do one with the lovely Adrian Mcrae. So I'll be talking tomorrow. I'll be talking to you about how we can get the country back on track electorally, some tangible ways we can fight different elections. But right now I'm going to take you through Adrian Mcrae. Who is he? Adrian Mcrae is an Australian businessman and politician from Port Hedland, WA. Originally, we love WA, don't we? We love our farmers out there. We love the sheep export. Originally from a farming family in New South Wales, he founded a mining company, which we'll come to in our discussion, and he also founded the Wings of Kilimanjaro charity. Elected as a Port Hedland councillor, I know some of you have heard of Port Hedland, in 2024, he sparked controversy with his appearance on Russian media for observing the election, but he is widely respected in freedom circles around Western Australia. Why is he respected? Why do I respect Adrian? Well, he's got skin in the game. He's someone that puts his money where his mouth is. He shows leadership both behind the scenes, but also up front. He takes the risks on organising events, much like Jamie McIntyre. And he's someone that is really respected in WA, especially because he flies out speakers that wouldn't ordinarily go to Perth or Australia. He flies them out, pays for their flights, puts on the event, takes a risk on, just like Jamie has with this one. And he's someone that really does get behind the freedom movement over there, like the Light Australia newspaper. Ladies and gentlemen, before I bring Adrian Mcrae up, we're going to play this very short 60-second video, and then I'm going to invite him up for an interview.
Port Hedland councillor Adrian Mcrae has been back on Russian TV, this time quoting a former Nazi party member and attacking Australian and Western media. Is that appropriate for a councillor to do?
Look, it's time for the councillor to go. He's an embarrassment to the city, to the town of Port Hedland. He's an embarrassment to Western Australia. He's using his councillor position and the privileges which come with that position to advance some international right-wing ideological position. It's, quite frankly, an abuse of his position. He has an obligation to conduct himself in a manner which is consistent with the needs and the requirements of his job, which is to focus on the people of Port Hedland, not engage in some sort of wacky ideological debate about a freedom of speech in Russia. Quite frankly, I think everyone in Port Hedland would be embarrassed by his antics, and I think it's time that he resigns.
Does the government have any power to remove him?
Look, we'll obviously need to investigate what rules and regulations he's transgressed in relation to his role as a councillor, but I think his councillor colleagues and the leadership of the town of Port Hedland should be sending him a very strong message, the same message I'm sending him today. Resign, stop it, you're an embarrassment.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Adrian Mcrae. Well done, you caused quite a stir. You have a seat. All right, so someone likes to stir the pot. Adrian, first question. Why do you have such a lack of self-preservation? You got no sense of it. You really don't care about yourself, do you?
Look, testing. Look, good question, Joel. I think what we've all been through the last 5 years in particular, you know, I don't sort of look at it as self-preservation. It's more preservation of our societies, of our communities, and probably in a greater picture of our country as a whole. I've sort of always been into pushing the limit on certain things. I think I'm still the only person in the world who's jumped off the summit of Kilimanjaro 3 times. I was a pilot as a young guy, straight out of high school. You kind of put yourself in positions when you get past that point of no return where it's always life or death. It's been in an aeroplane or running at a cliff with a paraglider above your head. You just kind of learn that, you know, there are risks, and in anything in life, it's a risk-reward thing, and certainly the reward is too enormous for what we've been fighting, and particularly the last 5 years, that I'm going to stand back when I have sort of the knowledge and the ability to do, make small changes, certainly in my community, and probably in a larger scope with what we've been able to do in Port Hedland with the Port Hedland motion that many of you may be aware of. So yeah, look, it's not. I don't sort of think of it as myself as some sort of hero that I'm, putting myself out there. I was just doing what anyone I think in my position would do if they had, my background and my knowledge.
Well, look, it is commendable, and I know everyone in here is nodding their head to that. Now, before we get to foreign politics, I do just want to ask you a question about Australia, because I mentioned mining company. You kind of know how the country works with lobbying. You understand what's going on with infrastructure. Over the last 100 years, 200 years, Australia, we really did do more nation-building projects. Like we were building dams, building the harbour bridge. We were refining our own oil here. Whereas more recently, we don't have like Project Iron Boomerang, where we're mining iron ore and we're sending it overseas. Instead, we're not actually making the steel ourselves. What is going on with Australia? Because I feel like we see similar patterns in Rhodesia, with Iran, with other foreign countries that are on the way up, but then they get kneecapped. Why don't we see these projects happening in Australia? Because you've sort of been in that sort of area, these nation-building projects. It's like we got cut off at the knees.
Look, another great question, Joel, and it's an extremely loaded question. There's a lot of layers of the onion to peel back. Someone said to me only, I think yesterday, actually, one of the members of the audience that I was having a chat with about this particular thing only the last couple of days, and really Australia has become a third world country. Now that's probably for us sitting in this room, and we all live quite wealthy lives comparatively to what we look on as third world. But when we look at our resources in this country, we've handed them sadly through years of mismanagement, and I guess there's part of the problem is very short political terms, so people never think in big nation building projects. No one's sort of thinking anything longer than a 3-year cycle. Usually it's we saw in that 2010 to 2020 time period we had we had 7 prime ministers in 10 years, and people just the power of social media. We could lose a prime minister just over one simple policy idea. A bottle of wine. Yeah, a bottle of wine or whatever it was. So of course, it's hard when these big multinational companies like BlackRock and Vanguard and all the usual suspects are able to take ownership of our resources, and at the same time, when there's nothing in it for them to sort of allow us to use those resources, and then sort of years of sadly revolving door politics where the likes of Scott Morrison, who signs an AUKUS deal worth hundreds of billions of dollars, basically as a provocation to China, then immediately goes and works for the Dine Corporation, who was the military industrial contractor who was set to make billions of dollars out of that on the Australian taxpayer. And that's been going on for a long time. Alexander Downer, another one, he was part of signing over huge resources of Australian gas off the western shelf of Australia, and now is has since been working for Chevron, who was obviously a huge beneficiary of those those enormous amounts of resources. And now, as a nation, I was only talking with an Australian politician recently in the Brisbane airport when I was passing through here, and we spoke about what happens with our resources. And in 2019, many of you would know, 2019 Australia became the biggest exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in the world. We overtook Qatar that year. We're only in the lead for a short amount of time because under the Donald Trump years, obviously there's a lot of gas opened up in the US and US leapfrogged us both. But in 2019, we're the biggest gas exporter in the world. And at that time, we, as a nation, got about $600 million of revenue from the entire export of being the biggest exporter in the world. In that same year, Qatar, who exported less gas than us, they got $29 billion for less gas than we exported. They got almost exactly 50 times more value out for their nation. And so it's going back to calling Australia a third world nation. It's the fact that we've got this massive amount of resource with and a massive amount of land with so few people. We sort of get to spread the the enormous wealth of, I guess, a labour force rather than the actual resource itself. If the nation actually was able to benefit from its own resources, we would probably be the most developed and wealthy nation in the world, bar none. But as it is, we'd live a very high quality of life, but live a very third world quality of political paradigm.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Yeah, because I think a lot of people, they do see that. They see that change and they're like, I wonder what people like Adrian who've been in those circles in terms of, the mining industry, what's up with that? How does that tend to work? But let's move to something which really did make international headlines, 200 million views online, the Port Hedland motion to actually hold an inquiry into the jabs and the contamination of the jabs. Briefly, could you mind letting people know exactly, in case they missed it, in case they didn't see the stream, what was that about? Why did you do it? What did you see as the big win from that?
Look, I've studied orthomolecular medicine, so nutritional medicine as a hobby for probably about 20 years. I lost a couple of close friends to cancer about 20 years ago, and I sort of been studying that stuff for a long time. And when the COVID thing came around, obviously I've been sort of involved in political affairs in Australia and internationally. Sort of most of my life I run big charity events in Eastern Africa and do these sorts of projects. So when COVID came around, I was sort of across a lot of the nonsense and didn't fall for a lot of the hype early on. I was quite outspoken in Western Australia, and I was noticing a lot of big speakers were coming to the eastern seaboard but not visiting WA. So in 2023, when Dr. Malhotra was touring Australia, I got in touch with the organisers for his trip, and I invited him, would he come over to Western Australia? Now, West Australians, they miss out on a lot of these type of events like we're holding here. And so I spoke with him, and then I thought, well, to make it worth his while, I'll get some other big name speakers. I was fortunate to get hold of Ed Dowd. Many of you would know, ex-BlackRock investment banker, who was speaking out against a lot of the numbers and a lot of the science that was being pushed out. And of course, I got Ed Dowd. I also got Naomi Wolf, who was very left wing. She'd come from New York Times, very left New York, but she'd spoke out against the COVID stuff when she'd learned a lot of the. Obviously, she'd written the Pfizer papers and did a lot of research on it. So I put on a big event in Perth, and that was kind of it was the week before Mark McGowan at the time resigned, but we put a fair bit of pressure on McGowan to come to this event, and there was a lot of media around this event. We had front page stuff on the only newspaper in WA, the West, and of course we like to put our hand up to say that we were partially responsible for making Mark Gowan resign at the time he did. But look, of course that was just part of our media ploy. We probably had nothing to do with that. But through that, I through the connections that I made at that time, became good friends with those speakers, and Dr. Malhotra invited me over to London. We did a bit of travel through Europe together, and he asked me later, would I put on host a show for him and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. During RFK's presidential campaign in San Francisco. So I put on a show for Bobby and Dr. Malhotra, and also flew in Vandana Shiva, who many of you would know from India. Dr. Drew, I got Dr. Drew to be our host, and Steve Kirsch, who is here. Steve put on an event after party at Steve's house on the night of the show. So that was really fun to get to meet Steve, because I'd been following Steve religiously up until that time. So it was a great honour, and thank you again, Steve, for allowing us the use of your beautiful home. But through that time, once you sort of start to move in those circles, particularly Steve and the US crowd, because at that time we were all following, Dr. Malone and Dr. McCullough and RFK and all these people. And when you sort of start to call these people friends, I was fortunate to be invited to a lot of the children's health events things, and then in May of last year, I was invited to go to the World Health Organization rallies in Geneva, Switzerland, and there was about 100 sort of key guests, and then obviously there was the regular crowd that was invited to come and march alongside us at the WHO rallies all through Geneva. Again, Steve was another attendee there, so we got to catch up again. But at that time, I got to meet and become good friends with Del, and also a Canadian virologist or microbiologist actually called Dr. David Speaker from Canada. And so Dr. David Speaker put his hand up. There was a time that there was the children versus. Many of you would know about the children case versus children versus Moderna in the High Court of Australia. That Katie Ashby-Coppins and Peter Pham and Julian Gillespie, these guys were putting a case through the High Court. But we'd heard from Kevin McKernan, probably the world's #1 geneticist. He was head of the Human Genome Project at MIT, part of the group that dissected the human genome over a 6-year period. But there wouldn't be a better geneticist on the planet than Kevin McKernan. And he had found in 2023, he had found through, just by mistake, that people had kept sending him, owning a genetic testing company, he had discovered people kept sending him all these vials of Pfizer and Moderna vials, and just randomly one day he wanted to get some pure RNA for one of the tests he was doing, and he did a test on some of these Moderna and Pfizer vials and found that these things were far from pure. They were actually heavily contaminated, like thousands of times over the World Health Organization legal limits of DNA contamination in the mRNA solutions. And so during the Moderna versus the children case in the High Court of Australia, the legal team got their hands on a bunch of vials of the mRNA and the mRNA jabs for the Pfizer and the Moderna, and asked all over Australia, can someone test these for us? We want to see if you can replicate the same thing that they found in the American vials in America. And no one in Australia would touch it. No universities, no scientific labs, because they could all potentially risk losing their accreditation from the Australian government if it turned out that Australia had the same contamination as they were finding in other places in the world. So they looked further afield. And of course, this has been a big part of what we learned through the whole COVID experience is why this event like we're having now is because free speech, America still has free speech, so doctors could speak up. If a doctor spoke up in Australia, everyone in this room knows this, hopefully, most people probably watching online would know this. But doctors in Australia and Australians as a whole, we don't have a Bill of Rights, we don't have a right to free speech. Whereas, thank God, Americans do have, and it's that ability of having that right to free speech which allowed doctors over there to speak up, and that gave us all these American doctors, while we sort of followed so many American doctors in Australia. We had probably just as many per capita, maybe more, speaking up in Australia, but couldn't do it publicly. They were very private, so no one really got to meet them or know who they were. But having had the American doctors with this freedom, this right to free speech, we learned that we could go offshore to get our information. Most of us got all our knowledge that we have of the whole COVID pandemic now came from America because of people like Steve Kirsch, and also because of great doctors like Ryan Cole and obviously Robert Malone, Dr. McCullough, these people that weren't going to lose their medical license to tell the truth. So through learning that, this Canadian microbiologist put his hand up in the University of Guelph, Dr. David Speaker, and said, I'll test your vials because your government can't prosecute me in Canada, can't prosecute me from here. Let me test them. Wow. So they shipped the Australian vials over to Canada, a bunch of Moderna, a bunch of Pfizer. And what Dr. Speaker found was that the Australian vials were up to 145 times the legal allowable limit through the TGA, but it's a very standardised thing. It's 10 nanograms per dose of DNA contamination. In most countries of the world that are signed on to the WHO, it's the same limit, 10 nanograms per injection. Now these things, the Australian vials, were discovered to be 145 times over. Now, David published this and found this information, and once he alerted the Australian authorities, no one did anything. The only one who did something in Australia was, he was a member of Parliament representative for Monash, Russell Broadbent from Victoria, Liberal Party member from Victoria. He wrote a letter to the Prime Minister in September, and he had 25 of the world's leading doctors, scientists, biologists, virologists, biochemists, you name it, had signed on to his letter to the Prime Minister, and it was ignored. He didn't get so much as a response. So he thought, okay, they all got together, Russell and David Speaker, and said, what can we do? Maybe we need to explain it better. So they put together a scientific summary. What does this DNA contamination really mean? And they got another 26, actually, ended up being 52 of the leading doctors, geneticists, you name it, the who's who of medical science on the planet had all signed on to this document and sent to the Prime Minister in Canberra. Now, the Prime Minister once again ignored this. Now, this is in September, so I was in the unique position that I was good personal friends with the Member of Parliament, Russell Broadbent. I was also good personal friends with David Speaker, the scientist. Now, I'm in Port Hedland, which, as many of you would know, Port Hedland, the Prime Ministers of Australia often call Port Hedland the engine room of Australia, because certainly during the GFC of 2008 through 2010-11, when the world was going into recession, Australia was in a boom because the iron ore price in Port Hedland had kept the Australian economy afloat through its massive amount of iron ore export. In fact, you know, it varies depending on iron ore price. The Port Hedland can contribute anywhere between 5 and 8% of Australia's national GDP flows through our little town of Port Hedland. And so the Prime Minister, when Albanese was elected, they called the first cabinet or the national cabinet meeting of the Prime Minister and Premiers. They brought it to Port Hedland, basically as a show of significance to, you know, Port Hedland and the significance on the national economy and the geostrategic importance of the entire town. And so I was in this unique position. I'm now on the council. I'd had quite a bit of notoriety because earlier last year, when I was invited as the only Australian international foreign observer for the Russian presidential election. Now, of course, many people would know me from that because when I came back, within 3 days of being back in the country, I didn't even campaign. Some friends wanted to use my name in local government election to win a by-election, and they used my name while I was overseas. I didn't campaign, didn't do anything, and of course, I won the election while I was in Russia. And so when I come back... Oops, exactly. Sorry. So when I come back to Australia, I'm now... The first day I landed back, I took my oath of office. The first thing I did on the morning I landed back, I took my oath of office, and that afternoon, I had the first ordinary council meeting of local government. Now, of course, no one cared about my statements in the Russian media prior to taking oath of office. As soon as I took the oath of office, the Sydney Morning Herald, within 3 days, the Sydney Morning Herald had me as the #1 news story in the world, simply for being an elected official and daring tell the truth about what I'd seen in a Russian presidential election. Now, I've run in federal politics just in 2022. I've overseen, I've scrutinised the referendum in 2024, I've scrutinised local, state and federal government elections. I had an understanding of it, but I just thought what an opportunity to be invited to go and oversee the Russian presidential election. I was only invited because another speaker that's speaking tomorrow, I think Ross Cameron is here somewhere, he was also invited, but he had a back injury and he had back surgery, so he couldn't come across. Now, and there are other members of Parliament actually invited, but they couldn't go because they were just too scared of what might happen to them politically if they went over to Russia. I wasn't in politics at the time, so of course, for me, it was an adventure. What a great thing to go and see. If it was a US election or it was any country's election that's significant on the world stage, I think most people would go who've had that opportunity. And so, of course, I had this big notoriety, and I'd had some, quite public stoushes with the Premier after coming back and telling the truth about what I'd seen in the Russian presidential election. And so, fast forward back to October, after the Prime Minister had just ignored all these letters from Russell Broadbent. I thought, what if Port Hedland? Imagine if I could get the Port Hedland Council, the most, as the engine room of Australia, where men, I like to say, are still men. It's it's a tough working class mining crowd, as you can imagine. We all wear high vis. It's not often we get to dress like this, and so I, as fate would have it, I also had Julian Gillespie, one of the original ex-barrister who was travelling around Australia, and he was part of the letter writing to the Prime Minister. He was part of all the legal cases that we saw in the High Court. Brilliant man that's donated years of his time. It's incredible the amount of work he's done. But he happened to be staying in my house because he was travelling around Australia and he was in Port Hedland at the time. And I said, "Hey Jules, what do you think we write a motion and see if we can't get the town of Port Hedland to back up Russell Broadbent?" And he was absolutely all over it. So we put some motions together, and just randomly, I've been following the COVID stuff closely for a long time, and my own company had just finished construction of a new cold body storage facility in Port Hedland. And we always joke, if this COVID thing goes bad, how funny would it be? Not funny, but you know, if you want to make some money in business, we probably should go into the cold body storage business. Now, funnily enough, I end up building a new cold body storage facility in my own town. The first time the town's ever had one. We're a town of 15,000 people. It's not like we need them. You know, there's one death a week there, they say. Anyway, so I just finished building a cold body storage facility, and I spoke to the funeral director, and I said, "Are you seeing anything different from, you know, recently? Why are we building a cold body storage facility in the little town of Port Hedland?" And he said, "It's funny." He goes, "At the height of COVID, we weren't doing a single funeral a week. In fact, we almost went out of business. Instead, we started a training business and teaching people to drive mining machinery and all sorts of random businesses like this." But he goes, and his excuse was through me, but he goes, after they opened the borders, because as many of you would know, the Western Australian borders were closed. We couldn't leave the state. We couldn't go out or come into our state for 2 years as Australians. We weren't allowed to go and see our families or anything interstate. And he said, it's funny, when they opened the borders, we stopped doing one funeral a week. We went up to one funeral a day. So the death rate increased sevenfold. And I said, what else happened at the time of opening the borders? You remember why they opened the borders? Because remember, the borders wouldn't open unless we had a 90% vaccination rate. And I said, what else surely it's not the borders could cause this sudden spike in deaths of sevenfold deaths. And he goes, no, it's not he goes, it's just they've obviously let the virus in. I said, but the virus is already here. And he goes, no, well, that's what it's done. They've let the virus in. I said, you don't think it could be this thing they're sticking in people's arms? He goes, no, it's not that. And I said, how do you know it's not that? And he says, well, me and my wife, we've had 6 each. And it was just, I was like, I might be putting you in your own cold body storage facility. Anyway, so, sorry, I've gone off track. I've gone off track a little bit. But I shouldn't say that because if they're watching, they're friends of mine. But
It's good it's not being live streamed.
anyway, so I thought I asked Jules if he thought let's put some motions together. So we put the motions together, and I called a special council meeting. You call a special council meeting, you've got to have support of a couple of other councillors. So we got 3 councillors to sign a document to go to council and to call a special meeting. And we called it on a Friday night because on the Monday night, as it turns out, I'm great friends with John Shipton, Julian Assange's father, and he wanted to go, who was also at Steve's house in the US. John comes to all of my big projects and big events and speaks at them, a wonderful speaker. Most of you have probably heard of him and seen him. But I just asked if we could, got my councillors to agree with it, but John wanted to go to Russia to the BRICS conference in November, or in end of October last year. And he didn't know anyone in Russia. I said, listen, I'll come with you if you want a companion. And I knew a lot of people over there by now. So I said, look, I'll go with you to Russia. So we called the special meeting on a Friday night, which is very unusual because meetings usually Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday in Port Hedland. So we got a big amount of the community to turn up to this meeting. And of course, there was only 7 of us on council at the time. And out of the 9, 2 people had resigned. And we got, on the night, we had 2 fence sitters. And as it would have it, literally the day before the council meeting, Rebecca Barnett had got a Freedom of Information request returned from the Australian government from the TGA because she had asked maybe a year earlier, what testing method are you using to validate your claims that these things are not DNA contaminated? And the Freedom of Information request had come back. More than 80% of the document was redacted, but part of the document that wasn't redacted, the TGA said, we are using the qualitative polymerase chain reaction, the qPCR test, to say that these aren't DNA contaminated. Now, Moderna, who holds the world patent for measuring DNA in mRNA drug solutions, they'd had that patent since 2015. Now, we had that patent in our hands, and that patent clearly says that if you want to find out how much DNA is in an mRNA drug solution, you do not use the qPCR. If you do, it will underread. It can underread 1,000-fold. But this is what the TGA of Australia is using to gaslight all Australians into saying that this stuff is safe and effective. Don't worry, we've tested it, it's safe. The DNA contamination is not an issue. Now, I had both documents, and on the night, I also had a deputation from Angus Dalgleish, probably one of the world's leading oncologists. He's a professor emeritus from St George's University in London. Of course, a lot of the scientists and doctors we saw speaking out through all of this COVID stuff were retirees because they could come out. Luc Montagnier, you remember originally he was the discoverer of the AIDS, the Nobel Prize winning scientist or virologist who discovered the HIV virus. he was the first to point out that, or one of the first to point out that the original, the strain or the original strain of the COVID virus, the SARS-CoV-2 from 2019, was clearly man-made. He'd said that before anyone had even heard of the virus, because he'd looked at it, and because he was retired, there's nothing that any government department could do to say that, most people were scared to speak the truth because they'd lose their funding or they'd lose whatever else. But Luc Montagnier he's well past retirement age. He actually died only a year before last. But so it was all those sort of calibre of people that were speaking up at the time. Anyway, going back to the Port Hedland thing, we had the motion, and of course the motion because of this thing, and we had the deputation of Professor Angus Dalgleish, and when he made his deputation, the mayor, because we hadn't seen the video, he made a video presentation. It was already pre-recorded earlier in the day, and so the mayor said we need to close the meeting down. We had to kick out all the gallery, all the people in the public out of the meeting because he wasn't sure what was on this thing. When we played the video, while we're out of standing orders, I said to the rest of the council, I said, listen, if any of you are going to tell me, because I knew what their debate would be, they'd say this is out of our remit, we're local government, we're not supposed to touch federal issues, state issues. And I said, if any of you are going to tell me that this has been tested, the TGA's already debunked this, here's the documents I've got. I've got this freedom of information saying the Australian government's using the qPCR, and I've got the Moderna patent which says the qPCR doesn't work, you can't use it. And of course, having those two documents, all these other councillors looked at me and went, shit, there goes our argument. Now when the debate comes up, what are we going to say if we say it in front of the public? And I just said, if you bring that up in front of the crowd, when the crowd comes back in the room, I'm going to destroy you in my closing argument. And they're all like, oh, okay, well, no one really knew what to do. So eventually, the vote went 5-2. And I didn't know. I thought, okay, it'll probably make local news, make big news. But literally within 24 hours, there was millions of views across Twitter. It was we were the first government in the world that had actually voted to demand a cessation, to stop all mRNA injections until such time as they could do some testing to show what the dangers of this stuff is. Now the TGA has since come out, and the TGA has said, look, it doesn't even matter if it's 1,000 times over the limit. The DNA contamination can't get inside your cell. Now this new technology, as someone here asked earlier, asked Steve about the mechanism of injury that we're seeing. What is the chemical, or is there something in them that's causing the problem? And I've had this chat with some of the greatest scientists in the world, and I'm fortunate to have probably somewhat of an answer to that. The DNA contamination, there is hundreds of different types of DNA. We don't even know what they all are. But this DNA, if you inject DNA like in an old tetanus shot from the 1980s into your arm, the human immune system will recognise that foreign DNA, destroy it immediately, and it'll be excreted through the liver and through the kidneys and excreted from your body. But this new technology of the coded messenger RNA, or the modified RNA as some call it, is wrapped inside lipid nanoparticles. It's basically a cationic, a positively charged cationic lipid nanoparticle, meaning it's like a little cholesterol, tiny, 1,000 times smaller. And in each injection, there is about as many as 40 trillion of these lipid nanoparticles in every injection. Now, these lipid nanoparticles are designed specifically to bypass your immune system. No one's immune system can break down anything that's inside those lipid nanoparticles. And those lipid nanoparticles, I said they're cationic, meaning they're positively charged, which by nature of law of physics, positively charged means they're attracted to the cell lining of the cell lining of the walls, which is negatively charged, and then through the mechanism of the same way cholesterol works in your system, it dissolves into your cell wall, and the payload of that lipid nanoparticle, all of it gets inside your cell. Now, this DNA contamination we're finding is not free, loose in the solution. It's wrapped and encapsulated in lipid nanoparticles. And so in every injection that humans are getting as many as 30 trillion messenger RNA particles wrapped inside lipid nanoparticles inside your cell. Now, some of these DNA fragments are what's called the SV40 promoter enhancer sequences, and this is the most frightening part, because the SV40, as many people would know, scientific laboratories all around the world, when they're trying to induce cancer tumours in rats or animals, they inject SV40, it causes a tumour, then they can go and do their tests on the cancer drugs that they're trying to promote for patenting for some sort of profiteering motive. Now, it only takes 3 of these SV40 promoter enhancer sequences to get inside a human cell to begin the cancer process, to start the genetic changes to start the cancer process. We're talking hundreds of billions of SV40 promoter enhancer sequences inside of every shot, which are encapsulated lipid nanoparticles, which is now why Australia, you've probably all seen only in the last few weeks, the Mail and a bunch of newspapers, Yahoo 7 has started talking about Australia now has the highest cancer rates in the world, and these cancers are horribly aggressive. They're, the new term, who'd ever heard of turbo cancer prior to the last 4 years? So when this thing obviously went quite viral, it obviously upset the Premier. The Premier attacked me. First he came after the Port Hedland Council because he didn't realise it was me, the Russian shit stirrer, that had a bit of a fight with him earlier in the year. And then, of course, 3 days after, he said to the press that the Port Hedland Council needs to stick to their knitting. Now, that pissed off councillors all across Australia, particularly Western Australia, because we work a lot. We don't get paid for what we do. It's just, it's a very thankless job. And so when I appeared a few days later in Russia, because I was over there with John Shipton to go to the BRICS conference, of course, when I turned up, I was the councillor that became world news for telling the truth about the Russian presidential election. There was media at the airport, and it just became one press conference after another. And so it was quite funny because the Premier is talking to, he saw me in Russia. Next thing they're saying that I was quoting Nazis, and I was over there at the behest of Vladimir Putin, all these nonsense stories.
Look how racist he is.
And of course, the Premier was, quite aggressive. I mean, he's had, and that's just one video you saw when I started. There's dozens of them, but he and I sort of fired back. He would tell me I need to resign. Then I'd say, well, listen, you were the health minister that force injected 90% of West Australians with a contaminated DNA gene editing therapy. I think it's you who needs to resign. I'm not resigning. Anyway, of course, that made it worse.
Sorry, mate, we've got to wrap up.
Anyway, so yeah, that's how I end up in the public stoush.
So you're an anti-vaxxer, okay. So he sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about, does he? He has no idea. Mate, that was a mate. You took me to school. We could chat for another hour. Maybe two. And this is the problem. This is why we need a whole country between us. I'm in Sydney. He's in Perth most of the time, Port Hedland. And I could chat to you forever, man, but I really appreciate it. I think there is a panel later with you. We didn't even get into foreign affairs. We didn't even get into Israel-Palestine. We didn't even get into that, but we will later. But ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Adrian Mcrae. Thanks, mate. Well done. I'll take that off you.